the Brighter Futures film about how ideas improve lives and change policy. It's a great pleasure to welcome Graham Underwood from the School of Life Sciences at the University of Essex. We're going to be talking about mud, microbes, diatoms, coastal environments and how they're affected. So tell us a little bit about your research and how it's impacting upon the wider world, Graham.
Thank you, Jules. Yeah, I've been working here for over 30 years now. My research is focused on estuaries and what we call soft sediment coasts. So coastlines like we have a lot of in East Anglia, southern England, full of mud, mudflats, salt marshes, habitats like seagrass beds, and habitats that are quite heavily impacted by human activity. Quite historical, actually. If you think about the UK, about Britain, many of our big cities and towns are founded and exist on estuaries. And so humans have been working in this environment and interacting with it for over 2,000 years. So we have a precious environment that does things for us, what we call ecosystem services, but it's also impacted historically and more currently by what society has been doing. And then we have this future challenge of climate change that is coming quite fast down the tracks towards us, and it will affect estuaries and estuary functioning quite a lot.
And so you've got those kind of interaction of the human impacts upon these environments, what we know about how they work in detail, and the actual, as it were, the environmental and the economic benefits that they provide for us. Just explore some of that a little bit further then.
Yeah, so estuaries are, I think of them as bioreactors. They sit on this interface between everything we do on the land, in the catchments of our land. Everything comes down the rivers effectively, or through our into the estuaries, and then through the estuaries out into our shallow coastal seas, what we call the neritic zone. So they are this sort of biological filter. And if they function well, they do a tremendous amount of useful things that help society. So they can treat nutrient loads that come down off farming. A lot of nitrogen comes from farming in the UK. A lot of phosphorus comes from our sewage treatment works. Even treated sewage has an impact on the environment. There's been a lot of obviously stuff about untreated sewage, but treated sewage still has an impact with nutrient loads. And estuaries can attenuate that through biological activity, microbial activity primarily. Nitrogen can be removed from the system, phosphorus can be trapped in the system. And that prevents things like harmful algal blooms happening in the shallow offshore waters.
So they're cleaning up,
exactly.
to use another kind of language. They're taking the things that we don't really want out naturally for free.
Yes, so our work here on the Colne estuary is a very well described European estuary now, because there's over 45 years of university work on that. We know about 40% of the nitrogen that comes into the system is taken out by biological processes before it gets to the offshore sea. If you get harmful algal blooms, they have significant health and economic impacts. People can be seriously ill from shellfish poisoning or poisoning into fish, and it has economic implications if fisheries are closed. So it's not a sort of esoteric worry, it's a genuine worry for the economy of the region. And here in East Anglia, coastal communities historically have been very dependent on iconic species like the native oyster. It's an important part of culture's sort of social history, actually.
For 2,000 years.
Yeah, exactly.
So tell us a bit about some of those individual organisms, oysters, seagrass. What else? I mean, what else are we looking at? Describe for us. You're up to your knees in mud on the estuary.
Yeah,
what are we seeing?
Okay, well, I think of the big four habitats. That we have salt marshes, which are really terrestrial habitats creeping into the marine zone, actually. All those plants that people are used to on a salt marsh are terrestrial plants that evolved to cope with a certain degree of marine inundation, tidal cover. So they're very special, and artists and people have written about those for many years. We have seagrass beds, which are sort of mysterious because you don't see them very much in Essex because of the muddy water. People think of seagrass being important in the tropics. But historically, seagrass, which is a flowering plant, was really extensive all around southern England. Much of it was wiped out in the 1930s by a wasting disease, and then coastal nutrient loading and human damage has destroyed much of what's left. But there is a restoration project on seagrasses going on. The real glue that sticks all this together, the third of the big four are oysters, again, which really were historically really important and are now being restored through lots of programs that the university is involved in. But the glue that sticks all of this together are mudflats. And they are a bit of a Cinderella habitat. It's one I really love. So if you go to a mudflat, it can look quite bare, and people talk about the wastes of mud and these sorts of things. But it's absolutely nonsense.
It's teeming with life.
Teeming with life, microbial and small invertebrates. And although many people know that birds use mudflats for feeding, the whole food chain is driven by a set of organisms called diatoms. So diatoms are a type of algae, a photosynthetic single-celled organism. And in a square centimetre of mud, you might have 200,000 diatoms, so many that it colours the mud this beautiful golden brown. And they are fascinating organisms. They have behavioural migration, motility. They can move. So they're not passive. They move up and down with the tides. They move up and down with light and disturbance. And they come to the surface and photosynthesize. And the carbon they fix drives food chains. We know that. If you look at the isotopic signatures of all the things that live in estuaries, fish and birds and worms and oysters, the bulk of their food comes from the production of these films on the surface of mud.
So we look at the mud and we think, erroneously, that we're looking at mud, but actually we're looking at a film of diatoms that are the generator for the whole ecosystem.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's something that's only really been firmed up, I would have thought, in the last 10, 15 years. Before, mud was seen as just this sort of place where not much happened. And people used to think everything in mud, like the worms and things that feed birds and fish, and ultimately any human products we take, were fed on, for example, organic matter coming off the land or out of sewage roads. It's not true. They obviously process some of that material, but a lot of it's based on these microbial systems. So a lot of the work I've done over the years has been trying to understand the behaviour, the photosynthesis of these things, the stresses, how they respond to stresses. We've looked at impacts of herbicides and ultraviolet light and temperature. And all of those things, of course, will change with climate change. So there's a real concern now about hotter, drier summers, which you might think, well, how does that affect intertidal zone? But of course, when the tide's out for periods of day, it can get so hot now that the photosynthesis can be suppressed during heat waves.
So in the heat wave that we had in the middle of this year, in the middle of 2022, when it reaches 40 degrees, that has a serious impact upon a wet environment that is actually dry for a few hours every day.
The temperature of a mudflat can rise by 2 or 3 degrees centigrade an hour. So, because you've got evaporation cooling it, but just the sheer amount of instant heat into that system. And maximum photosynthesis for these things is at about 28. So once you start getting into your 30s and things, then you're really pushing those systems down.
So tell us a bit about then the obvious challenges of climate crisis that are actually here with us already, but will accentuate some of these things that are already beginning to happen. At the coast, this sharp edge between the sea and the land.
The biggest,
what do we see and what concerns you, really?
The biggest challenge is sea level rise. Sea level rise is already, people say it's baked in. We've got at least 30 centimetres of sea level rise due to come to us, regardless of what we do around climate and global action on carbon emissions. It could be up to 1 metre if we don't get those global emissions coming down swiftly as well. That doesn't sound perhaps like much, but actually when you look at the coast like East Anglia, we're right on the edge of being flooded significantly in towns and cities and farmland. So that 30 centimetres coupled with natural events like storm surges or tidal surges will mean we have extensive flooding in large parts of the southeast of England. Now, what do you do about that? You can build massive concrete seawalls. You can engineer your way out of this solution. That's really expensive, and it doesn't actually create what we call a resilient coastline. It just creates an armored coastline. Hard edge, and when it fails, it's catastrophic. So the work we're doing now with agencies like the Environment Agency and talking to DEFRA and partners in the county councils and regionally is thinking about how you might make a more resilient coastline that uses what we call nature-based solutions. So let's enhance these natural properties of coastlines, the ability of mudflats and marshes to attenuate wave energy and to take the head off a storm surge so it doesn't flood, increase the amount of those habitats in the system, and get the benefits of increased water clarity, increased nutrient trapping, benefits for society because of sort of aesthetic use of the habitats, clean water, even fish and oysters. But the big questions that are outstanding is what's the ideal configuration to do that? So although restoration and realignments have happened historically in the last 50, 40, 30 years, much of that has been opportunistic, where particular farmers prepared to give up a piece of land.
One spot or another spot.
Or the wildlife trust has got a piece of land or something. What we don't really know, but we've done some work on this, is actually what the optimum configuration. Is a small piece of salt marsh as functional as a large salt marsh? How distant from bits of salt marsh would it need to be? And we know some of that from tropical systems. So mangroves and coral reefs and lagoons is quite understood how the connectivity works, how things like fish move between them and energy and nutrients. Surprisingly, we don't know that so well for these big 4 European habitats. Despite hundreds of years of work on them, it's not really been the focus. And it's partly because salt marsh people have only ever thought about salt marshes And seagrass people love seagrasses, but don't think about the other. And now there's a realisation, and I'm in a group of colleagues across the UK working with the Environment Agency to try and think about how these habitats actually interconnect. Because that connectivity across the habitats is really important. And we did some work a few years ago that showed that fish use of marshes, young fish use of marshes, was as strongly affected by the nature of the mudflats by the marsh than the marsh features itself. Slightly not what we expected, actually. We thought the marsh structure and function and size would be really important. But actually there was a real strong relationship with actually distance to pieces of mudflat and things. So to design a resilient coast for the future, and it's an active process, we need to talk to policymakers, we need to talk to landowners, we need to talk to agencies who have responsibility for flooding, town councils, and communities, and
help
say
communities understand what we're facing and what
can we
we're trying to
do, and can you protect and nurture these environments that can be quite neglected? Can you enhance them so that we get these benefits for society at the same time as enhancing the natural capital? So it could be a win-win, but there's quite a large behavioural change required for some people. And obviously, if your house is below sea level and you feel threatened about this, you want to protect your house. That's completely understandable. But the big picture means that ultimately some of these places will have to go back to nature, because we can't build a resilient coastline unless we do that. And that's the challenge, where we're trying to work with people who are, I'm a biologist, but you work with social scientists, and we work with people who work into communities to try and get that message through.
So at the core of this, there's the idea of regenerating environments and components of those, plants and oysters and others, that used to be more abundant and have declined. So we're trying to bring back some of that abundance to help do the job of these nature-based solutions. But then to design the whole of the coastline, or think about design in a kind of different way.
Yes,
really.
and I think that's my real passion now. I'm currently on a knowledge exchange fellowship funded by NERC, one of the research councils. And I think we have to think, the problem with a lot of conservation is it's about going back to something that was there, a sort of pristine past. But that's, I think, a folly, because the climate is changing so rapidly. We have to think about a future that we need to move towards. So it's not getting back to what it was like 200 years ago. We need to build a system that will be resilient for the next 50, 100 years. And that might not be the same looking species. It might look a bit different, because we've got Mediterranean species coming up the English Channel into Essex now.
Here already.
Invasive species that are well established. You'll never get rid of them. So we could spend a lot of time and effort and resource on trying to get back to something that actually has probably had its day because of the massive impact we've had on global climate.
So let's finish with some thoughts about pushing that kind of knowledge into policy and priorities for that. Obviously, there are big ones like reduce emissions, mitigate the effects of the climate crisis as quickly as we can. But as you say, some of that's baked in for the immediate future. What would you be saying if you had the chance to push those ideas into, well, from local to national policy, possibly even international? A couple of priorities that.
Yeah, well, in a way, we're doing that now, and that's the important thing. The Environment Agency has a programme called Rememory. It's restoration of meadows, marshes and reefs, and they want to restore 15% restoration of those habitats across England by 2035. And so we're working with that group to try and understand the best science to make those arguments. It's about effective implementation. Some of the policy drivers are there now. There's the new, ELMS, the land management system that the government's putting in. There is an understanding in the Environment Agency about the cost benefits and natural capital benefits of nature-based solutions.
And a 25-year plan.
Yeah, exactly.
We've already got that to kind of think ahead.
Essex County Council in the last year or two has just had a large climate commission. They've identified a whole set of targets and things to move towards. So I think one of our challenges now is the intentions are there. We need effective implementation. And so coming back to the coastal restoration, okay, there's a target, there's policy drivers, but how do you actually get that to work on the ground? So that's where we're working with estuary groups, landowners, the agencies, the non-government organisations like the Wildlife Trust, RSPB, all the sort of people who are involved in that, to try and get it integrated together. Because what I see, and it's the advantage perhaps of an academic position, is a lot of fragmentation of efforts sometimes. And what we really need to do is pull all that intent and goodwill together to actually make that step change forward. And I'm semi-optimistic. I think we can do it, because I think the pressures are building, and public understanding is changing. So another final element of this is talking to the public about it at all sorts of venues, from small village halls up to meetings, and going to talk to councillors and things like that, because they ultimately make the decisions. Our politicians have to make the decisions, and they need to know they're on safe ground, both scientifically and that there's as good a guarantee of success as we can give them, but also politically and socially, that the people are understanding of this challenge. And I think that's a really interesting thing to be moving into as someone who came from a science ecology background, to understand that the solutions are not just scientific, they're also social. But I'm not completely pessimistic. I think we're on the right track. I wish we could go faster, but isn't that just normal? You know?
Very good. And on that optimistic note, many thanks, Graham. We've been hearing from Graham Underwood. This is a Brighter Futures film. For more conversations on how ideas improve lives, pop over to our sister podcast, Louder Than Words.